The second story in Volume 2 of True Tales of a Traveller, Just a Businessman, is set in Indian-administered Kashmir in the mid-1980s, and it provides a picture of shoestring travel on the subcontinent in that era, as well as insight into the culture and politics of the region. In addition to being a travel story, Just a Businessman is also a story about religious and ethnic conflict and political upheavals, and the extent to which these can affect the life of a traveller or an outsider. Michel had left the hostel at the crack of dawn for an early flight to Kathmandu, Nepal. For the first time in months, I was at something of a loose end. Now, here I was in early March 1985, still unready to leave the country. The whole adventure with Michel, Richard and Inda had taken a few days shy of 3 months. Now it was finally over, and I was alone again. My mind turned to what had been my original travel plan before I had met those remarkable characters. The serendipitous meeting with my fellow ex-kibbutz volunteer, Refet Dave Clark, which I had very nearly missed, demanded at least some time catching up on the events of the past 3 years, so my trip to Amritsar was put back a couple of days. The following day, I spent a good deal of time with Dave and his girlfriend wandering around those various Delhi attractions that I had visited before, such as the National Gandhi Museum, Red Fort and Chandri Chowk Market, India Gate and the Raj Path and so on, all the while catching up on the events of the past 3 years. The train from Delhi to Amritsar took about 7 hours, in other words, most of the day. Travelling alone once again was certainly a very strange feeling, but I was also beginning to feel like an old India hand, and managed to have a fairly hassle-free trip. I was now used to shaking off beggars and insistent rickshaw drivers, and dealing head-on with train passengers who claimed to have booked my seat. A common trick employed by local travellers at the time in order to seize a seat by pretending they had booked it, assuming that the person occupying it hadn't. I found accommodation in a small, clean, family-run guest house, conveniently located only a few minutes' walk north of the station. I spent most of the morning of my first full day in Amritsar at the most famous building in Sikhism, the Sri Harmandir Sahib, or the Abode of God, better known in English as the Golden Temple. This was, and is, the holiest temple in Sikhism, and a must-see for anyone visiting Amritsar. I learnt the history of this gold-plated temple from a kind of museum within the temple. Apparently, the recent damage wreaked upon the temple by Indian troops was nothing new. The temple had been a target of persecution before, and was destroyed several times over by Muslim armies from Afghanistan and during the Mughal Empire. Religion-based conflict had been a part of the fabric of life of this part of the world for many centuries, and it still was, but the temple survived nonetheless. Within the temple grounds, very few Hindus or other non-Sikhs were to be seen. In fact, I felt a little conspicuous when moving among people, as the only man in sight with no headwear. In the late afternoon, I headed out by bus to a village on the border with Pakistan to see a military ceremony at the advice of Americans staying at the same guest house as myself, wondering all the way there why I was going to an obscure border village when I had hardly even seen Amritsar itself yet. The ceremony, called the Beating Retreat Ceremony, was held right on the border with Pakistan, and it made a strange and lasting impression on me. Which is to say that, at that time, although I thought it worth seeing, I didn't consider it to be anything particularly significant. Yet, over the subsequent weeks, months, and even years, the ceremony stayed etched deeply in my memory, perhaps because after visiting Indian-administered Kashmir, a majority Muslim region claimed entirely by Pakistan, and then visiting Pakistan itself, relationships between these two countries, and everything they symbolized, were often in my mind. The ceremony kept coming back to me. It seemed to sum up everything about the Indo-Pakistan relationship, including everything that was wrong with it. Held on the only land opening between Pakistan and India at that time, the ceremony involved soldiers from both sides parading back and forth in a marching style that would make the usual goose steps, so loved by totalitarian states, look tame. Though executed with professional precision, the head-high goose steps were powerfully delivered, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of genuine aggression. I felt that the soldiers would have been just as happy to deliver their high kicks just a couple of feet off the mark, right to the head of their counterpart marcher of the other country. Though this was the most hassle-free travel I had undertaken since being in the country, it was somehow also the loneliest. I was acutely aware of the absence of Michelle and Richard, those two seemingly irreplaceable characters. I even ended up asking myself late that night what exactly I was doing and why. For that reason, months after planning to come to Amritsar, I ended up staying there only 2 nights. I decided to move on the next day. Amritsar was fine, but there was nothing keeping me there. I would take a look at another controversial region, Kashmir, and if that also turned out to be just pleasant travel and nothing more, then I would move on once again. Early the next day, I took the train to the city of Jammu, a trip of about 4 hours. I had no trouble getting a seat in second class, and no hassle from seat thieves, beggars, or anyone else. Jammu was the end of the line. The remainder of the journey to Srinagar would be by bus. Close to the railway station at Jammu, the train pulled alongside a huge convoy of tanks bound for Kashmir. India obviously had a powerful resolve to secure Jammu and Kashmir. But in my mind, I associated tanks with flat, low-lying country, and couldn't imagine there being any use for them in mountainous terrain. What I didn't know at the time was that Indian Army tanks had seen action at elevations of well over 3,000 meters in Kashmir, and would continue to do so. I wondered how it was possible for tanks to get from Jammu to Kashmir, given that there was no railway line and only one through road. I concluded that if tanks could travel on the road to Srinagar without bringing traffic to a halt, then that meant the road had to be at least a broad 2-lane highway. I was in for a big shock. National Highway 1 is a road which stretches across a large expanse of Himalayan and sub-Himalayan terrain from Jammu to Leh, a town deep in the Himalayas at an elevation of about 3,500 meters. The higher section of this road, from Srinagar to Leh, also reaches an altitude of over 3,500 meters in places. I would first take the Jammu to Srinagar section. The Jammu to Srinagar section is lower, but nevertheless there were many places where the road was very narrow and unsurfaced at that time, and at over 2,000 meters in places, the mountainous scenery was very similar to that of the higher section. After 4 months in India, I probably wasn't expecting a super smooth ride, but anyway, I did eventually manage to doze off. When I woke up several hours later and looked out of the bus window, I was captivated by the breathtaking scenery. But my breath was only truly taken away when I looked directly below and saw nothing at all beneath the bus but a sheer drop. My head almost hit the overhead rack, and I stood there for a few minutes before I felt calm enough to sit down again. I didn't intend to look for houseboat accommodation, as I assumed it to be beyond my budget, but was persuaded otherwise by a houseboat owner who met me at the station. It wasn't the usual attempt to grab the bags and force the traveller to the place, which I had become used to in India, so I went along with it, again surmising that if it didn't fit the bill, I could look for something else the next morning. I was very pleasantly surprised. The houseboat I stayed on, like most in Srinagar, was on Dal Lake, a large lake with one extreme very close to the eastern side of the urban centre, the main body of the lake extending away from the city to the northeast. The lake is the most well known in the Kashmir Valley due to its location right next to central Srinagar. At the time of my visit, there were very few foreign tourists staying in houseboats in the off-season. At least I saw none at all, who looked obviously like foreign visitors in the first few weeks I spent there. Mine was the less upmarket looking of two boats belonging to Abdul, the man who met me at the bus station. He was a Muslim Kashmiri in his mid-30s who lived with his three-generation family on yet another boat on the other side of his more upmarket-looking boat. Nevertheless, having an entire houseboat to myself after all the hard travel and work in India was sheer luxury for me. Inside, the boat was furnished with British colonial-era carpeting, armchairs, table, wall paintings and so on. All had obviously seen better days, yet were still clean and presentable. Compared with any of the other places I had stayed on the subcontinent so far, life on the boat was very, very comfortable and very, very easy. The still off-season accommodation cost was the equivalent of about £1 sterling per day. This included a simple breakfast of fried eggs, local flatbread and delicious local honey, which would be served to me shortly after I put my head out of the window and called for it. I soon fell into a lazy, or at least very relaxed routine in Srinagar. In a sense, it felt as if I had left India and all its associated inconveniences behind, and, as I was soon to discover, from the point of view of many Kashmiris, that was indeed the case. Although I knew I would have to face those inconveniences again before going anywhere else. While the night in March was still very cold, and the mountains evidently still snow-capped, the days were often quite warm and balmy, at least for a few hours. Flowers were blooming and the leaves of trees budding by the roadside on my bike trips. The sublime beauty of the mountains not far from Srinagar made my morning bike rides a regular activity. Naturally, though photography was not the aim, or even one of the aims of my morning bike rides, I took my low-budget East German-made SLR with me every day. Nobody, photographer or not, could fail to appreciate how worthy of recording those scenes were. As he placed a cup of tea before me, my host asked me a question which left me momentarily speechless. "How long have you been in Pakistan?" I tried to evaluate his question. His English was excellent. He couldn't possibly have made a mistake. "You mean Kashmir?" I finally asked. Yes, of course, I mean Kashmir," he answered with a disarming laugh, which made me feel he'd been making some kind of joke. "There are big changes coming to Kashmir, I guarantee you," he told me. I was used to meeting people with unsupported and unsupportable political views on my travels, so I attached very little value to this man's claims. But, indeed, the ethnic tensions that could then be felt brewing at that time would culminate in an exodus of many thousands of Hindu Kashmiris from the Kashmir Valley over the subsequent 4 years. Although that certainly didn't affect the determination of the Indian government to hold on to Kashmir, perhaps it even had the opposite effect. I didn't see the businessman Halif for several days thereafter, as my houseboat host, Abdul, had been repeatedly trying to persuade me to take a 2-day trip round Dal Lake. I was motivated more by a sense of duty than anything else to take the trip. As it happened, I thoroughly enjoyed the slow shikara trip around the lake and took a full 36 exposure roll of black and white photos. We camped at what was probably the most remote spot from Srinagar, and even there I felt I was given VIP treatment, sleeping in my own tent while Abdul shared a shabbier tent with the boatman, who apparently made a living providing these boat trips. He was an excellent cook but spoke little English. Abdul provided a commentary on the features of the lake and the work and lives of the people who lived on or by it. "How would you like to come to Leh the day after tomorrow? I've just decided to go there," Halif asked. I had heard of Leh a town in the Ladakh region mentioned in travellers' circles always as a remote, almost mystical place, and one more Tibetan than Indian. I hadn't considered it reachable for me, as it was so deep in the Himalayas and at such a high altitude. It was also a border region. In Delhi, I had read a Times of India article which mentioned that the territory to the east of Ladakh, the Aksai Chin, had been invaded by China in 1962 and occupied by Chinese troops ever since, while the area to the north had been seized by China from Pakistan the following year. "Why isn't the road usually open?" I asked. "Too much snow on the road. But anyway, it's open now. What do you say? Want to come? I need a couple of strong, healthy young people like you to come with me in case I have any trouble." I laughed and asked, why? What kind of trouble was he worried about? "Oh, trouble with the car, trouble with the weather. It isn't an easy road." "I guess the road is something like the one from Jammu?" I asked. Halif confirmed it was, but much worse. "Wow, you mean there's worse?" Halif pointed out, finally giving mention to the matter that had been in my head all morning. There was nothing to stop us going over the edge if we came away from the road. Then, for what seemed like the longest time, but was probably only a matter of minutes, we fell silent. Neither Arun nor myself wanted to distract Halif from this difficult driving task with unnecessary conversation. For a few moments, the atmosphere seemed a little more relaxed. Then the car stalled. Looking at the driver's mirror, I clearly saw Halif's eyes widen.